Thank you. Guten Ivan, if I've got that correct. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm here to talk about CSS and SVG and how they make a dynamic duo. And that just won't do. That just won't do. No. I'm here to talk about CSS and SVG, the dynamic duo of web languages that are bringing interactive animated graphics to your web browser. Okay, CSS and SVG, I want to explain to you, are a superhero team. Like all superhero teams, they are better together. But like all superhero teams, there's an origin story. And the first part of this origin story, you've heard a bit already today, but I made cool animations for it, so I'm going to tell it to you again. So it starts in the beginning with HTML. And I'm going to get my notes so I can keep track of this. So in the beginning, there was HTML. HTML, on its trusty steed, HTTP, set off across the infinite plains of the internet, connecting to people through the magic of hyperlinks into a world wide web. And the people, they loved HTML. The people loved HTML so much that their web browsers gave HTML amazing new powers to wield. Oops. Okay, I'm gonna try this again. There we go. The people and their web browsers, and specifically, gave HTML the font tag so it could style its text. And they gave it the center tag so it could lay out its text. They gave the big tag and the small tag and the marquee tag and the blink tag. And HTML, well, HTML suffered. It suffered under the weight of all this presentational markup. So HTML got a sidekick. HTML got CSS. And like a helpful squire, CSS took care of all the presentation. Took care of all the styling details so HTML could focus on content. But you've got to understand that CSS in this area, it was just a sidekick. It was only focused on helping HTML, and since HTML was always about text documents, CSS was all about styling text documents. There was a bit of a dead-end storyline involving XML, but it really didn't have any character development for CSS. It was still styling XML text documents. And then I press tab. Enter SVG. Now I will say as an aside, my background is science and journalism and SVG for data visualization. Not a graphic artist or an animator, and it took me way too long to do those little animations, so I don't have animations for this slide, so you're just going to have to close your eyes and imagine. To get back to the story, enter SVG. SVG was a new kind of hero for the web. SVG was a graphics language for the web. SVG using markup to create pictures. And SVG's special skills were refined in some secret location under the instruction of mysterious people with names like SVJesus, who these days goes by Chris Lilly, and he's talking next. And these team of crazy web standards people gave SVG powers never before seen on the web, like the power of partial transparency. And this is where you imagine that shield up on the screen sort of fading in and out like a secret ninja. gave it the power of transformable coordinate systems, and now that shield is zooping across and spinning around and doing all sorts of crazy contortions. And it gave scalable gradients without horrible ping hacks that just got all gritty if your screen was too big. And all this was very new, but I need you to understand, from that very beginning, SVG had CSS. HTML sidekick became SVG sidekick. Now, SVG did not need CSS. SVG was perfectly capable of doing all these things on its own with XML attributes. But CSS was there if it wanted to. All these cool things could be done with CSS syntax. Now, I can say, just as an aside, HTML's other sidekick, JavaScript, you might have heard of him. He came along too, but if you start talking about JavaScript, it tends to take up the whole talk, so this talks about SVG and CSS. Now, CSS, when hanging out with SVG, did what it always did. It handled text styling, it handled font selection, it handled text decoration. But SVG didn't have a lot of text layout, so CSS had some time on its hands. CSS started taking new powers. It started assigning fill colors. It started assigning stroke dashing patterns. And it did this neat thing where it sort of acted as an assistant managing all the cross-references between SVG's shape markup and SVG's graphical effects markup, which defined things like gradients and filters and masks and all these other effects that needed to be kept track of when you needed them to change how you draw a shape. And here's where we get to the trial part of the story, the hard times that our heroes have to fight through. Because you see, SVG entered a world wide web that wasn't quite ready for it. Browsers didn't know what to do with SVG. They tried penning it in plugins like they'd done with Flash and Java applets. And at the same time, graphics software, well, they were happy to have SVG, sure, why not? But none of that CSS stuff, that's web stuff. So SVG, and especially SVG and CSS, were somewhat lost. It wasn't clear what place they had. And in this time, SVG started hanging around with the bad crowd. It started hanging around with XML languages like XSLT, FT, and XFTO, and who knows what kind of acronyms come up. And those XML languages, they really weren't going anywhere, not on the web anyway, maybe print world, but not on the web. And then SVG decided it was going to impress mobile because it was lightweight and it went trimmed down and we got SVG Tiny. And then smartphones came out and nobody wanted tiny stuff on the web, they wanted the web on their phone. And all that SVG Tiny effort kind of went nowhere. So SVG was a little lost. But CSS, well, CSS was still on the web. And CSS, it's still a little pal HTML. HTML, well, there is no web without HTML. But see, you gotta understand, HTML and CSS, they had their own issues. You know, HTML, it needed a new look. HTML needed some new moves. HTML had to compete with new iPhone apps. And HTML talked to CSS, and CSS had learned all these fancy new graphical effects from hanging out with SVG. CSS had some ideas. So CSS started doing graphics. CSS and HTML moved forward without SVG. CSS introduced gradient functions. CSS introduced partially transparent colors. CSS introduced animations. All these things SVG had done, but CSS was doing it now, and CSS was doing it differently. Different syntax, different way of doing things. For SVG, well, for SVG, this could have been the end. SVG could have been left behind, forgotten, another sad victim of the XML, HTML wars. But remember our hero HTML? the knight from the beginning, it rode up on its fine horse HTTP, and it led out a helping hand, and it said, "It's okay, SVG, you can come with us, just leave all those nasty XML namespaces behind, and you can put your SVG markup right in an HTML5 document, and the HTML5 parser will be cool." And so SVG was welcomed back to the web. Browsers started implementing it, and then what do you know? People started using it. And the thing is, CSS and SVG also got back together. CSS and SVG started working together, and literally in the working group sort of sense, people started working together. It was wonderful. But in the modern web, CSS is no longer a sidekick. CSS and SVG are equal partners. You may have heard of CSS transforms, you may have heard of CSS filters or CSS masks and clip paths. The thing you gotta understand is these are not replacements for SVG. These are extensions of SVG. These are SVG effects that can now be added to any element that CSS styles. These are SVG becoming a sidekick to CSS. And the other thing is that in the past 15 years since CSS and SVG first got together, CSS has grown up a whole lot. There's a whole lot of things you can do now that you couldn't do then. You've got transitions and animations, we've got media queries, we've got supports rules, we've got better web fonts, we've got font features that you can turn on from the OpenType font files. And all of these new skills, well, they can go straight back into your SVG file and enhance it that way. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. It has not been easy. There have been many problems. There are still problems. Harmonizing different ways of doing things has resulted in a lot of bugs, a lot of confusion. There were specifications that were written. There was browser code that was implemented without carefully considering edge cases, without carefully considering backwards compatibility. We've got CSS kind of running back and forth between the HTML way of doing things and the SVG way of doing things. And things have gotten dropped on the way. But things are getting better. Bugs are getting squashed. Gaps are getting filled. SVG and CSS are moving forward together, the dynamic duo bringing easier interactive graphics to the World Wide Web. Okay, enough story time. What you want to know is, what can the dynamic duo do for you? Well, to understand that, you've got to understand that each superhero on this team is bringing their own special skills. So, since you, I assume, are all pretty familiar with CSS, I'll focus first on SVG's special skill set. Oops. Now, what can SVG do that CSS, even modern, awesome CSS, can't do alone? Well, SVG's got shapes. And yes, I know there are blog posts out there about creating shapes just with CSS. And yes, some people make really cool art with it, but this is SVG's thing. Shapes, real shapes, one element that can have all sorts of crazy curves and angles and multiple points and no hacks with nested elements and clipped overflow, just a shape that you define and use as a shape. This is what SVG does best. SVG's also got patterns. Patterns, simple markup, complex patterns if you want complex markup, but you're not hacking around with overlaid gradients, you don't have separate image files, it's just a pattern that you define and then use as a fill pattern. SVG is also really great with dashed and dotted lines. If you've ever dealt with dashed and dotted borders and wondered why the heck is this so god darn ugly in certain browsers, or just darn different in one browser to the next, you will love to meet SVG's dashed and dotted strokes, where you have full control over the length of the dash, and this includes, you may have seen this animation of a line that draws itself. I was going to have an example of this, but as I said, slow with the building graphics. But it's just a dashed line. It's just a dashed line that gets a longer dash, and you eventually draw the entire shape. Oh, come on. SVG also does text on a path, and I'll have some. No, I had an example at the top in my title screen. Just text, but not in a straight line. Text on a curve, text on an angled line, text on a zigzaggy line, because sometimes straight lines are boring. It's something you can do. Don't do too much of it, but for a nice little title screen, it's pretty fabulous. SVG also does stroked and filled text. It does stroked and filled shapes, but it also does stroked and filled text without hacking around with a dozen different text shadows or with WebKit background clip. It's just you tell the shape that you want a gradient inside the text, or you want a blue outline, whatever you do, no problem, SVG can handle it. And most importantly of all, SVG does scale to fit graphics, scale to fit text. You tell the browser that this graphic takes up this much space. It says, well, I've only got this much space, or maybe I've got that much space, and it adjusts everything to fit. So this is a small set of the feature set, but these are the most common things that SVG is really great at that are a pain to do any other way. But of course, CSS has its own special skills. And what's the most important CSS skill? Well, it's also the most basic. Classes. CSS classes are so old news you probably don't even think about them anymore, but they save an awful lot of typing compared to styling each element individually with XML attributes, especially if you ever need to go back and change those stylings later. Just being able to apply a style class, apply a style block, wonderful, and unfortunately, lots of visual SVG editors don't really make use of it much yet, but that's starting to change. But even cooler than classes, CSS has pseudo-classes. You want every other graphic on the page to be a different color? No problem. CSS got an nth type class or pseudo-class for that, because sometimes even typing class names is too much typing. But the best kind of pseudo-classes of all are the interactive pseudo-classes. So I'm talking your hover, your focus, your active, your target. Things that can change your styles based on how the user's interacting with the web page. These are awesome for creating graphical effects like a dorky little slideshow series that I had earlier on. Interactive pseudo-classes are, of course, even better when you add in transitions. Not only can you change state, but you can smoothly transition between them. And, I know CSS transitions kind of get tacked on as a side effect to CSS animations. Keyframe animations are cool. Keyframe animations are very cool. But most of what you can do with CSS keyframe animations, you could do in SVG with the SMIL animation elements. Doing transitions with SMIL animation elements, it's not pretty. I have tried. It is not pretty. Just trust me when I say CSS transitions are awesome. You can do all sorts of things with transitions. You can even use transitions with media queries. You can move things when the user turns their phone over, resizes their web browser, and of course, you can set up all sorts of layouts with media queries. Except in practice, media queries aren't quite as awesome with SVG as they could be, because you can't control a lot of SVG layout from CSS yet, but that's going to change maybe in a year or two. So, caveat. But there are still pretty cool things you can do with media queries and SVG right now. I'll have a couple examples later. Another really, really awesome thing about CSS is the calc function. this idea that you can mix multiple units, some of which are absolute, some of which are relative. You've got viewport units, you've got percentage units, you've got font relative units. You can just add them all together. That's awesome. Now again, it's not quite as awesome as it would be if you could control more of SVG layout from the CSS, but again, that will happen in the next year or two. And a brand new CSS trick that I think is really awesome is CSS variables. Still new, not in every browser yet, but they are going to be extra awesome for SVG. They're going to be awesome everywhere, but they're going to be extra awesome for SVG because of the way style inheritance works with SVG's use elements, and I'll have an example later on of how that works. Now, as I said, each of our superheroes brings their own special skills, but they're more awesome together. So there are also all these areas where they've been working together to get better. Transforms. 2D transformations, part of basic SVG layout from the beginning. Now they're in CSS, and not only are they extended to other elements, but we've got better shorthand functions, we've got units that you can use, and percentages with bugs currently, but getting better. And 3D transforms, brand new, crazy, 3D transforms. You can use 3D transforms in most browsers currently, even on SVG. They've also got clip paths. Now, clip paths, CSS had this clip property since like way back when, but it didn't really know what to do with it. It just had this one rect function, and its syntax was awful, and there's really only one use case, and that's to hide text from the screen, but still make it available to screen readers. And that kind of sucks. But now CSS supports SVG's clip path property, and it allows you all sorts of clip shapes, including, I tried to find a clip shape that you could still notice it but be readable, but you can do more interesting clip shapes probably on images. And CSS now has all sorts of shorthand functions, so for simple shapes you can define it right in your CSS file, but you want more complicated shapes, create a SVG clip path element, reference that. Then there's masks, because sometimes you don't want nice, neat clipping lines. You want to fade in and out, so a mask, it fades in and out based on the color or opacity of another image. CSS has got new shorthand. You can just reference a different image file or a CSS gradient function, but you want more complex effects, create an SVG mask in your markup, and you can reference that from your CSS file. Same with filters, blurs, drop shadows, color manipulation, lighting effects. There are all sorts of things you can do with SVG filters that would take up a couple different conference talks over. CSS has wonderful new shorthand functions for the most common effects, and you may be starting to see a pattern here. If you want fancier effects, create a filter element in your SVG markup and use that as in your CSS filter property. And you can go all sorts of things. And finally, there are blend modes. Blend modes in SVG were actually part of the filter spec, and they allowed you to assign a filter that said blend it into the background with special blend effects. It relied on an attribute that told the browser whether it should save the background, and visual editors kind of overused that attribute and said save the background for everything, and the browsers responded by not implementing this feature, which was very disappointing. But the net effect was that we have these new blend mode features, which are actually much, much easier to use and beautiful and pretty for crazy colors and helping ensure text contrasts against the background no matter what the color of the background, all sorts of fun things. There are even more areas being discussed of SVG features that are going to get imported possibly into CSS for all your web page styling needs, talking about having filling and stroking using the SVG syntax of any text, so you don't have to create an SVG element, you just can style your headings directly. Talking about using the viewbox scaling mechanism to be able to scale composite layouts or images and videos. Nothing certain yet on those front. Can't give you any sort of deadline for when it'll happen, but there is lots of ongoing work happening. Now, I know y'all are mostly CSS folks, so if you're coming from CSS Styling HTML to CSS Styling SVG, there's going to be a few things you'll want to keep in mind. First on, leave the box model behind. SVG layout does not use the box model. SVG layout does not use margins and padding and background. There is only one box in the SVG graphic, and that's the box around the parent SVG element. That's the only one on which backgrounds and patterns and borders will have an effect. The layout model for SVG is an absolute layout model. That doesn't mean you use position absolute. The position property has no effect. But conceptually, it's similar to absolute layout in CSS, where things get drawn where you tell them. They don't adjust to the position of something else. If you tell one thing to be drawn on top of another thing, it will be. And if that makes your design awful, you got to fix it. The browser doesn't relay out things for you. Another thing to understand is that your units are all arbitrary. SVG is scalable vector graphics, and all your units scale. So when you scale up your SVG user unit, which is just another fancy word for CSS pix unit, all your other units scale as well. So your inch will still be 96 pix, will still be 96 SVG user units, but it might be a millimeter wide, it might be a foot wide, I don't know. It depends on how the entire graphic has scaled up or down. Everything scales in proportion, and that's another thing to remember. Everything scales together. Once you put that viewbox attribute on, you've got a two-dimensional aspect ratio. If you compress the width, you compress the height as well. That's opposite if you think about it from how text works. If you have a paragraph and you shrink the width, it ends up wrapping and taking up longer height to balance up the constrained width, but the text size stays the same. In SVG, by default anyways, you can constrain the width, you constrain the height, text size shrinks down, and if you're not careful, things can become unreadable. So I'll have an example of how you can adjust for that. An important thing to understand as you're switching from CSS and HTML to CSS and SVG is that color, the familiar CSS color property that you use all the time to set the color of their text, it doesn't do anything to your SVG graph. But it is still really useful. It is really useful because we have this current color keyword. Current color keyword has been around for a long time, but not used a lot outside of SVG, but it can be used anywhere you use a color property. Anywhere you want a color, you can say current color, and what does it do? It looks up the current value of the color property on that particular element and uses that color instead. And this means you can use color as a variable, even in browsers that don't support CSS variables yet. Now, the one most overriding thing that you're going to have to understand if you're going to use CSS for SVG is that there are bugs. There are bugs, there are bugs, oh my goodness, there are bugs. Now you might say that this is true about all CSS, especially new CSS, and that is true, that is also true. But there's more in SVG, just because it's newer in browsers, there is a smaller user base, there is a smaller group of web standards people working, there are fewer browser developers working, bugs accumulate, they don't always get caught during the canary and preview versions of browsers. They get out into the wild. Just welcome back to Quirks mode. Test everything, test everywhere, test often. Now, those I think are some of the most important things where people get confused when they're starting with SVG. But the other issue is, how are you using SVG? Because all SVG are not alike. There are 3 different ways you can get SVG on the web, and each have different restrictions on how you can use it, which techniques you can use, and if you're really cool on a certain technique, you have to think about how you're actually going to use that SVG and whether you can use that technique. First one, probably simplest to understand, SVG as an image. So that could look like an IMG tag in your HTML that just points to an SVG file. It could look like a picture element with a source tag that points to an SVG file and some boring old PNG file as a fallback for people that don't support picture and SVG. Or it could be an SVG file that is used as an image in your CSS, as a background image, or even a list image, or possibly even a border image if you really want to punish yourself. And all of these are included when I talk about SVG as image. And when you're talking about SVG images used as image files, no scripting, not in an image, no interaction, no user interactions get passed to the actual document inside that image, which means no hover effects, no clicks going through, nothing's happening, communicating from the outside document to the image document. There are no external resources loaded. When you load an image, that's an external resource, but it's not allowed to load secondary resources, which of course means no external style sheets, no web fonts, and no external photographic images embedded in your SVG. However, a style block works fine. You have a style block inside your SVG file, and then inside that style block you can have media queries, you can have @supports rules, you can have a certain number of pseudo classes that'll still work. But that style that's inside your SVG file, there is no style inheritance from your main document. There is no communication and cross-referencing of styles between the two. They're completely separate. An important thing, a useful thing, is that when you've got an SVG in an image, if you've got media queries in that SVG file, those media queries are relative to the size of that image as it's being drawn on the web page. So you don't have to worry about how big the overall layout of the page is. It's going to adjust to how big that image is in that particular time you're using. You may have heard people talking about wanting container queries for media queries and responsive layouts. It's kind of like that. You're adjusting for the actual elements' dimensions. Another thing, as I said, you can't use hover effects, but you can use target effects, with the target being the target fragment on the URL when you embed that image. You can embed it as logo.svg #fancy. And if you've got something inside with an ID fancy and styles that trigger when that element has the target, those styles are going to get triggered. But you'll note I say these should work. They usually work in most browsers now for the IMG tag. Support's not as good within CSS. I think WebKit and Blink both still ignore target fragments on images in your CSS. Might be fixed by now, but test everywhere. And the other thing I've got up there is SVG views. I don't have a lot of time talking them, but SVG views are a special type of target fragment. Instead of just targeting an element, you can target a new view box and create a new shape. So for example, in your picture element, you could actually have two different source tags that both point to the same SVG file, but with different target fragments, so that you have a portrait layout of that SVG cropped one way and a landscape layout cropped the other way based on your picture element media queries. Other things in your SVG image is declarative animation, so that's your keyframes animation, limited amount of transitions. I'm not sure what you'd be transitioning to or from. And the SVG SMIL animation should work. Again, should. There are some browsers that don't support either of these in SVG yet. And Firefox for a while, I'm not sure it's fixed yet, wasn't showing CSS keyframe animation in images, but again, should work. It's possible. You can have animated GIF images, you can have animated SVG images. Another very important thing about when you use SVG as an image, all the text in that SVG document is not accessible. It's a separate document, it's not text that you can select, it's not text that you'll find when you do a Control F search, and it's not accessible to screen readers. You need to give your image tag an alt attribute the same as you would any other image tag. There's one exception, that's WebKit for a while was making the SVG accessible, which was actually a really, really problematic bug because it was ignoring the alt attribute and instead looking to see if there was any text in the image file. The way around that was putting role equals img on your image tags. Bug, I think, has been fixed now, but you might still want to throw the role equals img on just to make sure your alt text gets used correctly. So that was all SVG as images. The next way to get your SVG into your website is as an embedded object. What do I mean by an embedded object? I mean something like object with a data attribute pointing to your SVG file, and type, that's the MIME type image / SVG plus XML. Just memorize it or find a good place to always have copy and paste ready. Could also use it as an iframe. Should be pretty much the same features. The one difference is that iframes don't scale automatically. If you do an SVG as an object, it should scale auto size like a image does. Iframes don't do that. And if you're really old school, you can do an embed element pointing to an SVG. Now, features of these embedded SVG documents is you can do scripting. You can run JavaScript in an embedded document, but it is still a separate document, so it has a separate DOM. Depending on cross-origin restrictions, you may be able to communicate between the two with window.parent and similar properties, but you've got two different scripting environments. Now, you've got scripting, you've also got interaction. You've got user events, and that includes CSS pseudoclass interaction, but those events don't bubble out of the embedded document, which applies to JavaScript event bubbling, also applies to stuff like a CSS hover class. If you put a hover selector on the actual object element, you're never going to see anything, because when the user's mouse is over that element, the hover effect's going to be eaten by the embedded document, not by your parent document that has the actual object in it. Animation is okay, whether it's declarative or scripted. External style sheets are okay, as well as the style block, of course. There is still, however, no style inheritance from the external document to the nested one. And you still have media queries relative to the actual size you give that object or iframe. But you also have this target in SVG views because you're embedding the SVG with a specific URL. You can still put a target fragment on that URL. And SVG text should be accessible as part of its being interactive. Works better with iframes. Objects have bugs. I found a bug just this week as I was doing these slides, trying to tab into my nested objects in Chrome, and it wasn't working at all, so that's why I'm using Firefox. But yeah, bugs everywhere. But ideally, the text should be available and it can be selected and searched if somebody can actually get focus into the SVG. I think that's a new bug, and hopefully it'll be fixed soon. I have filed a bug report for it, but yeah, be warned. Third way of doing SVG, this might be what you've heard about. It's certainly the most popular new thing, is inline SVG. So what's that? That's SVG directly in your HTML markup, right as a child element of your figure or span class icon or whatever. Just write the SVG markup right in there, or you can create it with a script, maybe vanilla JS like this, maybe some fancy scripting library, just inserting SVG elements straight into the DOM. When you're using inline SVG, scripting is okay, but you've got to be aware it's one DOM. It's all connected, maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. It's depending what you're doing. You just got to be aware of it. You might need slightly different scripts compared to a separate SVG file. Interaction is okay, and events bubble up, which means both JavaScript events and CSS selector pseudo-classes. Animations is fine. Any styles in your SVG are styles for the whole document. Any styles for the rest of the document are styles for the SVG. You've got two different SVGs with two different style blocks. Their styles are going to cross back and forth because it's all one document, and nobody supports the scoped attribute on the style element. Media queries are media queries for the entire document, not for your just SVG. So less convenient, maybe more convenient in some cases, but something to be aware of. You can do limited amount of target styling, but it's based on your overall page URL, same as any other target styling. No SVG views, though. The SVG views are special target fragment handling rules for SVG files. They don't work in HTML files. One best thing about inline SVG, it's the best support for making text in your SVG actually accessible. Still not perfect accessibility, we're working on it, but it's the best. Usually the plain text is accessible, even if roles and structures are a little confusing. So, that's my big information dump, throwing as much information as I can in your brain. I've got 15 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, well, I've got all these slides online. I'm going to run through a whole bunch of cool demos really fast, and then you can go online and read the descriptions and play around with them yourself. So, real-world problems with CSS and SVG. Easy icon color themes. These are all the same basic SVG markup. They're not terribly pretty icons. The first row is just using the core SVG style properties, fill color, stroke color, and the color property with current color, and everything inherits, and you can style the same icon differently every time you use it. Next one is a demo of getting more color options and stroke width options by throwing in CSS variables. Current color also can be used for its original purpose, which is to coordinate with surrounding text. So I've got icons that match the color of the hyperlink, including the active color when you click on it. And that's useful for inline text icons. Okay, can I backspace out of there and tab through? You can do interactive icons. So this is a demo I've created for the book I'm currently working on of using form verification pseudo-classes You put in reasonably useful answers to the form, it suddenly becomes valid, and the stoplight changes color. So red for invalid. If it doesn't like your telephone number, oh, that doesn't work. Should work. Anyways. So this is just pseudo-classes on the form element inheriting into an inline SVG. And changing the which gradients are being displayed in the stoplight graphic. Fun with hero text. If you're going to have a big hero image, you might as well have fabulous text, and you might as well make that text editable, selectable. So this is a demo in the SVG text layout book started by Kurt Cagle, and it's just a JPEG image in a pattern that is then used to fill text. And in some browsers, not this browser, you even have text shadow on it, which is kind of cool because nowhere in any of the SVG specs does it mention text shadow, but CSS is used to style SVG text, which means CSS text effects can apply with limited browser support. It's getting there. This is not text shadow, this is SVG filters that have been added to give text a beveled effect. Just something different, a little brighter. This particular effect you couldn't do with the shorthand functions, but in some of the new browsers you will be able to take this exact SVG filter and apply it to your H1, and without having to deal with SVG text layout, which is such a pain I wrote a whole book about it. Filters are also lots of fun for photographs. This is actually a black and white photograph. This is what it looks like without the filter. This is what it looks like with the filter. I think Yuna's going to be talking about color filters a bit later. So, fun things with image maps. This is a demo by Dudley Story. HTML has had image maps since way back when, where you can add links to different parts of an image, but they're not responsive. They only work at a certain pixel size. SVGs are scalable. SVGs have links. You can add hover effects to those links. You can then click through, and it's trying to load a site. Sorry, shouldn't have done that. And it eventually loads. That was a bad site to load. That's come visit me in Alberta sometime. That was just a map talking about resizing the scale of it, but as I mentioned, you can also deal with lots of maps have text, and when you scale things down, it can be a problem. But add a couple media queries in there to change the font size or the stroke width at different sizes, and you can adjust. And there was a great article in SitePoint just a couple weeks ago. If you get the online version, there's links to it where he explains that technique a little more. And you can do similar media queries on logos. So one logo file has your big logo and your small logo. And got a whole list of ongoing issues. And I'm out of time, so ask me about them later. And as I said, the slides are online as this view or as an article view with more links in them. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we take a seat over here?
Certainly.
There's a lot of interesting information about SVG. I love SVG. Is there a kind of like a can I use overview of SVG features anywhere?
There isn't a really good reference. Can I use has some entries for the most common things, but not all the details. There's a couple people trying to keep track of bugs. Emil, who's here today, is a GitHub repo. We're trying to keep track of all the browser bugs in one place, just as an easy reference. But yeah, as part of the SVG spec work, we're trying to, next step will be building a good test suite, and once we have a good test suite, hopefully compiling the actual test results in a way that you can easily recognize which features are supported where.
Okay, there's Lorenzo says that he recently noticed that the SVG blur filter performance is much lower than CSS filter blur on Retina.
That, I can definitely believe it, because probably more optimization has gone into the shorthand because there's fewer options. It's easier for the browsers to optimize it, and also the newer code has been written and optimized more recently. The browsers might not have gone back and refactored their SVG filter code. So yes, for many reasons, if all you need is something that can be handled by the shorthands, use the shorthands, but use the longer version if you want the more complex effects.
Okay. I think we didn't have much time for questions, but I think we have to stop now. So if you have questions for Amelia, you're going to be around.
I'll be around for the
Yeah?
afternoon.
Okay, thank you so much for
Thank you.
giving your talk.